My name was Janet Marshall. I was 44 when I walked free after 8 years behind bars. All that time, I lived on hope. Letters from my husband, photographs from my parents, postcards from old friends. I believed I would return to a place where someone would open the door for me. But when I stood on the porch of that old house with a suitcase in my hand, the door didn't open because the house was no longer mine, because the family that wrote to me no longer existed. They had erased me, quietly, neatly, like a mistake. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name was Janet Marshall. I was 44 years old the day I stepped through the gates, but in this chapter of memory, I was 36 and still holding on to who I used to be. Back then, before the fluorescent lights, before the smell of steel and bleach became part of me, I was a school librarian in a small town in upstate New York. Not just any librarian, but the kind who remembered birthdays, who gave extra bookmarks with handwritten notes, who helped shy children find their way through books as if they were maps home. I knew how to arrange the shelves by season: mysteries in October, love stories in February, gardening in spring. I kept a jar of mints on my desk, and I had a soft spot for anyone who didn't quite fit. I wore cardigans and tied my hair back with barrettes that didn't match, and I had a laugh that sounded too loud for a library, but was welcomed anyway. And then one morning, the life I had built, quiet, stable, ordinary, was ripped apart by a pair of cold handcuffs and a sentence longer than most marriages: 8 years. That's what they gave me. 8 years for something I still can't write without my hand shaking. By the time I entered that concrete world, my wrists had already learned how to rest in stillness, but my mind hadn't. It wandered every night. It clung to the memory of polished wooden shelves, of the way sunlight fell across the reading room chairs at 3:17 p.m., of the scent of children's books after story time. That's what hurt the most: the absence of small, mundane, irreplaceable things. In the first week inside, I learned the rhythm of survival. Wake before the others, eat quickly, speak less, never show surprise, and guard your mail like it's breath. Letters became the only proof that the world outside still held a space for me, however small. And they came surprisingly, in slow but steady cadence. The first arrived 3 weeks into my sentence, a simple envelope with my name, Janet Marshall, in handwriting I knew better than my own. It was from Michael, my husband, who still signed his name with that slanted M he'd had since college. He wrote on stationery with little pine trees on the edges, the kind we used to keep in a drawer by the telephone that hadn't rung since the verdict. Janet, it read, I saw a robin today near the hydrangeas, the ones you planted before winter. They survived. So will you. He wrote about mundane things: the way the snow had softened that year, how he overcooked the turkey, how he found one of my old scarves and couldn't bring himself to wash it. There were no declarations of love, no promises, just the steady murmur of a life still breathing on the other side of the fence. I read that letter at least 20 times that night, folded it carefully, slipped it under my mattress where I had made a small hollow space lined with fabric. My first little shrine, my first act of faith. The second letter came 2 weeks later, then another after that. His words never grew poetic, but they were full of color. He told me the snow turned to slush, that he tried making the cherry pie from my recipe and failed spectacularly, that the neighbor's dog had puppies and he named one bookmark for me. I laughed out loud when I read that and earned a sharp glance from a woman across the cell block. After that, I learned to read in silence, but my chest still ached with the same warm laughter. Then there were the letters from my mother, sparse, stiff, written on floral cards with short phrases. Thinking of you. Your father says hello. Stay strong. I could hear her voice in every word, controlled, cautious, afraid of letting too much spill. She never asked questions, never mentioned the case, but she kept writing, and that was more than I had dared to hope for. I kept them all. In a shoebox I was allowed to store under my bunk. I stacked every letter, every postcard, every envelope with my name handwritten by someone who still believed I existed. I tied them with a hairband I found during laundry duty. The box smelled faintly of glue and laundry soap, but to me, it smelled like home, like dignity, like something not yet stolen. There were days when the letters didn't come, weeks even, and those were the days I imagined the worst, that Michael had forgotten, that my mother had died, that the world had finally closed the lid on me, like a drawer sealed shut. I would lie awake, eyes fixed on the flickering light above my bunk, trying to will a sound, any sound, that resembled a knock on the cell bars, followed by the words, "You got mail." I began to measure time not by meals or count of nights, but by envelopes, blue ones from my mother, white from Michael. Once, a postcard from someone I barely remembered, a former colleague, I think, who had read about me in the local paper and wrote, "I still believe you." I kept that one closest. Over time, the ink faded, but the words burned deeper. The walls of the cell were rough, unkind, with initials carved in places too high to reach without standing on the thin frame of the toilet. The concrete floor was always cold, no matter the season, and yet, with each letter, something warmed inside me. It wasn't hope exactly. It was smaller, quieter, like a pilot light flickering in a house long abandoned. I watched women come and go, some angry, some empty, some still fighting demons that had followed them through steel gates. I tried not to be any of them. I tried to remain a memory of myself, wrapped in the thin armor of printed words and folded paper. Once, a woman named Trish tore up a letter in front of everyone. Her hands shook as she did it. No one asked why. We all just looked away. But that night, I took my shoebox out and read every letter again, whispering the words under my breath as if to memorize them in case they too vanished. Every page was a lifeline, every sentence a small reminder that I had not disappeared entirely. Even if I no longer had shelves to arrange or books to stamp, I still had a name. I still had someone who wrote it down. That was something. I didn't know then that ink could lie. That warmth on the page didn't guarantee warmth in the world. I didn't know that memories could be rehearsed through letters written by hands already reaching for something else. But I believed. And belief, even in the coldest place, is a dangerous thing to carry, especially when it fits so neatly in a box under your bed. The morning I stepped out of prison, the world felt indecently bright. The sun didn't wait for me to adjust. It burned against my eyes like a truth too long ignored. I held a paper bag in one arm, filled with things that didn't belong to any life I recognized. Shoes with soles too thin, clothes that no longer fit, a wallet with no purpose, and a bus ticket printed on fading thermal paper. The guard hadn't looked me in the eye when he handed it to me. He didn't need to. I was just one more released body, an outgoing shipment. I walked away slowly, like the ground beneath me might reject me. It was too soft, too yielding. After years of concrete, the feel of grass underfoot made my knees buckle slightly. I paused by the gate, not out of sentiment, but out of disorientation. The world I had left behind had changed clothes in my absence. It no longer wore the same face. The bus came exactly 7 minutes late. I sat by the window, clutching the strap of my bag, and watched the landscape unfold like a movie I couldn't follow. Everything looked familiar but wrong. The stores had changed names. Gas stations now sold smoothies. Children wore headphones larger than their faces. People didn't speak to one another. They touched glowing screens instead. The road signs were the same, the ones that marked exits to towns I used to know, streets I used to turn onto, the diner where Michael and I had breakfast every Sunday after church. I searched for that green sign as if it might still be holding its breath for me. When it passed, I closed my eyes. The driver announced the stop, and I stepped off. I didn't know what I expected to feel when my shoes touched the same pavement I'd once walked in another life. I only knew it didn't come. There was no spark of recognition, no deep sigh of homecoming, only the hollow click of my steps and the faint rustle of leaves that didn't remember me. The house sat at the end of the block, just past the lilac bush that had once filled our bedroom with spring each May. I remembered that scent better than I remembered my own voice. I had written about it in letters. I had dreamed of it in my cell. It had become a promise, a symbol of what was waiting. But as I walked up the street, something felt off. The bush had been trimmed down to a skeleton. The gate had been painted over. A new number plate had been installed beside the door. The curtains were white, not the beige ones I had chosen. The mailbox was a sleek black cylinder, not the rusty blue one Michael had repaired a dozen times. My feet slowed as I reached the sidewalk. The porch light was on, though it was midday, and on the porch stood a pair of children's rain boots, bright yellow, the kind I had never seen before. I froze. The wind shifted slightly, carrying the scent of laundry detergent and freshly cut grass. My heartbeat seemed to move up into my throat. I took one step toward the door, and the weight of memory crashed into me. I saw our old welcome mat, the one with the faded phrase, "Come as strangers, leave as family." It was gone now, replaced by a plain rubber mat with no words at all. The door opened. A woman stood there, tall, neat, with hair pulled back in a ponytail. She held a baby on her hip. The child looked at me with wide, blinking eyes. The woman didn't smile. She didn't frown. She simply stared as if I were a mistake on her doorstep, something misdelivered, a misplaced package. I opened my mouth, but no sound came. She stepped forward slightly, adjusted the baby's position, and said a name I recognized only because it used to be mine. "Janet?" I nodded. She didn't invite me in. She didn't move aside. She shifted the baby higher and spoke again, more quietly. "Michael doesn't live here anymore." The sentence sliced the world in two. It was said without cruelty, without pity. It was simply a fact, offered like a spoonful of medicine. My legs gave a little, but I didn't fall. I asked, quietly, where he was. She hesitated, then told me he had moved upstate with his wife. Her, the woman in front of me, wife. The word didn't make sense. It bounced around inside my skull like a marble in a glass jar. I had been gone 8 years. We had exchanged nearly 100 letters. He had signed everyone as my husband. He had written of lilacs and cherry pie and a scarf that still smelled like me. He had written as if he were waiting. But he had sold the house. He had married someone new. He had built a life I wasn't a part of. The woman didn't slam the door. She simply nodded once and stepped back inside, as if I were weather. As if my arrival were an unfortunate but passing storm. I stood on the sidewalk for a long time, long enough for the sun to shift positions, long enough for the baby to cry, and for the sound to disappear behind the closed door. I didn't cry. I walked. I walked with no direction, carrying a bag filled with the remains of a life that no longer existed. I passed familiar places that had unfamiliar names. I passed the old library building, now boarded up. I passed the grocery store that had been converted into a gym. I passed people who didn't look up, who didn't know the name I used to carry like a crown. At the edge of the park, I sat on a bench and took out the last letter Michael had sent me. I unfolded it with trembling hands. I read every line, every comma, every closing signature. There had been no hint, no warning, only soft words and weather updates and the illusion of waiting. I placed the letter on the bench beside me and let the wind carry it. For the first time, I saw clearly. I had not returned to a home. I had returned to a place where I no longer belonged. The house had changed hands. The man had changed hearts. The future had turned into someone else's present, and I was a ghost in broad daylight, haunting a street where no one waited. I wandered the town like someone searching for her reflection in broken mirrors. Every corner had a memory, but none of them answered when I called. The streets knew my footsteps once, but now they turned away, indifferent, letting me pass like dust blown through the cracks of a forgotten story. The coffee shop where I used to grade papers had turned into a nail salon. Gone were the mismatched armchairs and clinking cups, replaced with bright lights and sharp chemical smells. I stood across the street for a while, squinting through the glass, hoping to see some remnant of who I had been. But there was nothing. Not even the mural I had once painted on the back wall, a quote from Dickinson surrounded by lavender vines, had survived the repaint. It had been scraped away, just like my name from the mailbox. I sat in a small park not far from downtown, on a bench that was slightly crooked, its paint chipped. Children played nearby, their voices rising like birds, bright and sharp against the dullness in my chest. I didn't recognize them. Of course I didn't. But I watched, as if watching might give me something to hold on to. A little girl ran past with scraped knees and a juice box. Her laughter reminded me of my niece, Emily. She had just started kindergarten the year I was sentenced. I remembered the curls bouncing on her shoulders, the way she used to hand me drawings and whisper, "I made it for you." I tried to find her online at the library. Her name didn't come up. Or maybe it did, and I didn't recognize the woman behind the name. Perhaps she had changed her last name. Perhaps she had forgotten me entirely. Perhaps she had been told not to speak of me, not to remember the woman who had once braided her hair and tucked her into bed. I went to the old bookstore next, though I knew before I arrived that it would be gone. I had worked there on weekends during college, dusting shelves and restocking romance novels in alphabetical order. It had always smelled like paper and ink and old wood. I loved the quiet there, the way no one asked too much of me. But now, standing in its place, was a frozen yogurt chain with bright plastic furniture and machines humming like bored insects. I didn't go in. I turned instead down the alley beside it, where once I had carved my initials and Michael's into the red brick. It had been a silly thing, a high school gesture, but we'd done it one rainy afternoon. We kissed after, laughing. I looked for it now, hoping time had missed that one small corner of rebellion, but the wall had been sandblasted, clean, cold. The letters were gone. I walked back toward the bus station, unsure why. I wasn't going anywhere. I just needed motion, something to fight the stillness that was closing in like fog. On the bench by the terminal, an older man was feeding pigeons with mechanical rhythm. I sat at the other end, and he didn't look at me. We were both ghosts in our own ways. I wondered what he had lost. He didn't ask what I had. It began to rain, not the kind that soaks, but a light, persistent drizzle that makes the air feel heavier than it is. I didn't move. I let the water darken my sleeves, let it trace the lines of my collarbone like fingers remembering skin. No one offered an umbrella. No one saw me. I was invisible, or perhaps I had become someone they chose not to see. Back at the shelter, the bunk above mine remained empty. I traced the rust on the springs above, watching it like a map of constellations. The ceiling fan spun slowly, blades heavy with dust. Every night it groaned a little more, like it too had grown tired of going in circles. I started writing again, not in letters. There was no one left to send them to, but in a notebook I bought for 99 cents at a thrift store. I filled the pages with pieces of myself, fragments that didn't fit anywhere else. I wrote down the names of people I remembered, even if they didn't remember me. I listed the smells that had comforted me: cinnamon, old books, the leather of my father's jacket. I wrote the dates of birthdays, anniversaries, even though I had nowhere to send cards. They became like spells, these words, incantations to conjure the people who had vanished. I tried calling my parents once. I used a borrowed phone and stepped outside to do it, hands trembling. The number still worked. It rang. Then a voice I didn't recognize answered, cool and firm. They had moved. No forwarding address. The line went dead before I could speak. I stood in the alley behind the shelter afterward and stared at the sky. It was a dull gray, the kind that looked like it might never clear. I thought about the people who now occupied the lives I had once been part of. New tenants in old rooms, new hands on old doorknobs. I was the letter that never arrived. The dish left unwashed. The photograph turned face down in a drawer. I wandered through cemeteries sometimes, not because I knew anyone there, but because the silence didn't accuse me. No one looked through me. No one turned away. Among the headstones, I felt less alone. I would sit under a tree and imagine conversations with those who could no longer leave. I pretended they asked me who I had been. I told them stories. I made them laugh. I made them cry. I let myself be known, even if only to the dead. One day, I went to the DMV to try to renew my ID. The woman behind the counter took my paper release form and stared at her screen for too long. Then she asked if I had a permanent address. I said no. She asked if I had two forms of identification. I said no. She printed a temporary one. The photo was unflattering. My eyes looked tired. My hair was pulled back too tightly. The name on it said Janet Lynn Parker. But I didn't feel like Janet anymore. I wasn't sure who I felt like. I looked at the ID for a long time after she handed it to me. I put it in my pocket like it was a keepsake, not a tool. The truth was, I had been erased not by a system or a judge, but by time itself. The people I loved had gone on living, and in doing so, they had edited me out of the story. I was a footnote no one read, a ghost without a portrait. And the cruelest part? I still remembered them. Their birthdays, their laughter, the shape of their handwriting. But to them, I had become something inconvenient, a name better left off invitations, a story better left untold. So I stopped looking. I stopped waiting for a familiar face in the crowd. I stopped checking mailboxes and online directories. I stopped walking streets hoping someone might call my name because I had begun to understand something essential. The people who don't exist to the world don't stop existing. They just learn to live in the cracks, in the spaces between sentences, in the silence that follows someone else's joy. And in those spaces, I was still breathing, quietly, but still. It happened on a Tuesday, not a special Tuesday, not one marked by thunder or flowers or a blood moon, just a plain off-brand sort of day, too warm for October, with brittle leaves skittering across the sidewalk like they had somewhere to be. I woke up to the smell of burnt toast from the shelter's kitchen downstairs. It crept through the vents, bitter and clingy, and clung to my clothes like smoke from a house that no longer stood. I lay in bed a few minutes longer than usual, watching the ceiling tiles ripple slightly in the fan's shadow. My hands rested over my ribs, tracing old bruises long since healed, as if my skin still remembered what it meant to hurt. I had nowhere to be. I had nothing waiting for me. But my body still rose at 6 out of habit, as though someone might call my name for count or hand me a tray with powdered eggs. I folded my blanket, smoothed the creases, tucked the corners. The ritual was silent, rehearsed, automatic. And when I looked up and caught my own reflection in the square mirror above the sink, something paused inside me. It was the eyes, not tired, not sad, not lost, empty. I stared at that face for a long time, like I was waiting for it to blink first. Then I dressed and left, slipping through the back door so I wouldn't have to nod at the woman in the lobby who always asked if I needed to talk. I didn't. What I needed didn't have a name anymore. The streets were already humming. People passed with earbuds and coffee cups, shoulders drawn inward against the chill that hadn't yet fully arrived. I moved among them like a thread slipping loose from a coat, part of the weave once, now just a loose end brushing the hem. I walked aimlessly, letting my feet choose. They took me down to the train tracks, past the lot where the farmers market used to set up on weekends. The wooden stalls were gone now, replaced by scaffolding and a sign advertising Luxury Residences Coming 2026. A photograph of a sleek couple with shining teeth smiled down at the empty gravel, as if daring it to believe in marble countertops. I kept walking. Under the overpass, someone had painted words in yellow spray paint. "We remember you." The letters were sloppy, uneven, but I stopped in front of them and stood still for a long time. I didn't know who "you" was. I didn't believe it was me. And yet, I stood there like it might be. Around noon, I found myself near the edge of the park, where the benches had no backs and the pigeons knew no fear. I bought a cup of watery coffee from a vendor who didn't look at me, just slid the paper cup across the counter and took my dollar with the same detached motion I had once used to hand out exam papers. I sat on the farthest bench. The sun was high, too high, bleaching everything into flat tones. Across from me, a group of teenagers laughed over something on a phone. Their laughter sounded like a foreign language. I could recognize the rhythm but not the meaning. I watched them for a while, sipping coffee that tasted like metal and ash. And that was when the thought came. Not like lightning, not like a whisper, just a thought. They don't see you. They don't want to, and maybe they never did. It landed gently, like dust settling on a shelf. I didn't fight it. I didn't deny it. I let it sit because something about it felt true in a way that nothing else had in a long time. I sat there, holding that truth, turning it in my mind like a stone. I traced the edges of it, the cool, smooth shape of it, the weight it carried. And then, like water rising slowly over the edge of a glass, it overflowed into other thoughts. I remembered the letters my husband used to write, how each one had begun with the same phrase, "We miss you," and how I had clung to those words like driftwood, believing that the current of his love would carry me home again. But maybe that current had never existed. Maybe I had mistaken obligation for affection, or guilt for devotion, or maybe, and this was the sharpest part, maybe the love had simply run out, and no one had the courage to tell me. Not until I stepped outside and saw the locks changed, the pictures taken down, the voicemail that said, "Please don't call again." I hadn't understood then, not really. But now, watching strangers fill the spaces where I once belonged, it became clear. I had been waiting for permission to return. Permission that would never come. I wasn't exiled. I was erased. And on that bench, in that too bright sun, with half a cup of coffee in my hand and pigeons pecking at invisible crumbs by my feet, I understood what that meant. It meant I was free. Not the kind of freedom they wrote about in greeting cards or whispered about at graduation speeches. Not the soaring eagle, flag-waving, bootstraps kind. No, this was a lonelier kind of freedom, a quieter one, the kind that arrived only after every bridge had burned, and you had nothing left but ashes and your own heartbeat. But it was freedom nonetheless. It meant I didn't have to pretend anymore. I didn't have to chase shadows. I didn't have to knock on doors that had already been bricked shut from the inside. I could stop looking. I could start walking somewhere else, anywhere else, because no one was waiting, and that meant no one was in the way. The pigeons scattered as I stood. My knees cracked. My shadow stretched out before me, longer than it used to be. I followed it, not knowing where it led. And for the first time, the not knowing didn't feel like a sentence. It felt like a beginning. There's something strange about paper. It holds so much and weighs so little. It bends without complaint, curls under warmth, absorbs every inked confession, and yet remains flat and silent. In prison, it was the closest thing to a hand I could hold. A rectangle of reassurance, folded in three, passed through metal bars like a blessing. And for years, I believed in those blessings, believed they were written in the same ink as love, sealed with the breath of someone who hadn't forgotten me. I kept them in a shoebox beneath my cot, letters from my husband, from my parents, from my sister, the ones that came monthly at first, then quarterly, then whenever. Each envelope carried a piece of the world I was no longer part of, and I read them like a starving woman savoring crumbs. I memorized their curves and loops. I ran my fingers over the creases. I imagined their voices, imagined the table they sat at while writing. Sometimes, if I pressed the page close enough, I thought I could still smell home. I never let anyone else touch them. They were my secret scripture, my private choir. When the noise of the block became unbearable, metal scraping, women screaming, the bark of guards and the hum of flickering lights, I would unfold one of those letters and let it muffle the world. I believed them, every word, even the ones that were too careful, especially those. When they said they were proud of me for staying strong, I believed it. When they said they would be waiting when I came out, I clung to it like an oath, And when the words grew shorter, the lines more rushed, the paper more generic, I told myself they were just tired, but not gone, not gone, until the day I was released, returned, deposited back into a life that no longer had a drawer with my name on it. The first week outside, I stayed in a shelter with peeling walls and cracked linoleum. The air always smelled like boiled onions and cheap detergent. At night, I could hear someone crying through the vents, the kind of crying that doesn't ask for help, just leaks out slowly, like something rotten finally finding an exit. I didn't cry. I unpacked what little I had: a toothbrush, a change of clothes, and that same shoebox, its corners worn thin, its contents trembling with the weight of my belief. I took it out on the third night, sat cross-legged on the floor under the dim ceiling bulb, and opened it like a casket. The letters were all still there, fragile and yellowed, their folds soft from too much unfolding. I pulled out the one from the first Christmas I spent behind bars. I remembered the red marker hearts along the edge. I remembered how long I'd stared at that one line. "Next year we'll be together." I read it again, only now I saw what I hadn't then: the forced optimism, the vagueness, the absence of a date, a plan, a promise that meant anything real. I read more. Pages that once made me feel warm now felt hollow, like whispers written for ghosts. And maybe that's all I'd ever been to them: a ghost they tried to remember until it became easier not to. One by one, I laid the letters out around me like bones, pieces of something that had once stood upright. I read the one where my husband talked about replacing the roof, the one where my mother said she was praying for my soul, the one from my sister that ended with "stay strong," but not "love Hannah." That was the last one. I sat there for hours. The bulb above buzzed. A roach darted from behind the dresser. The air in the room thickened, filled with the soft rustle of lies on paper. Or maybe not lies. Maybe just convenience. Maybe they wrote what they thought would keep me alive. And maybe that was the cruelest part. Not the forgetting, but the illusion of remembering. Around midnight, I went outside. The yard behind the shelter was nothing more than patchy dirt and a broken fence. A trash barrel stood near the alley, blackened from years of use. I dropped the shoebox beside it. My fingers shook, not from cold, but from memory. I didn't want to burn them at first. I just wanted to hold them in the light, see if anything about them changed in the open air. But the wind stirred, and one of the envelopes fluttered toward the ground. It landed face up, the return address now faded to a blur. And suddenly, I didn't want to hold them anymore. I lit a match. The first corner curled like a leaf in autumn. Orange licked its way across the page, slow and almost loving. The words warped. The ink bled. I watched "We miss you" vanish into flame. Then the others, a handful at a time, crackling, hissing, whispering their final surrender. Smoke rose in ribbons. Ash danced in the night air like gray butterflies. I stood there, feeding the fire, until all that remained was a soft bed of char and the warm silence of ending. I thought I might cry. That grief would rise up and demand space. But it didn't. What I felt was stillness. For the first time in years, my hands were empty. And it didn't feel like loss. It felt like clarity. Those letters had held me together once. They had been a tether, a thread, a hope. But now I understood. They were also the cage, words that kept me waiting, obeying, believing in a version of love that had long since expired. I had mistaken ink for intention, paper for presence, Now I had neither. And for once, that was all right. I walked back inside with smoke in my hair and ash on my sleeves. I washed my hands slowly in the sink, watching gray swirl down the drain like the last remnants of a language I no longer needed. That night I slept without dreams. No memories, no imagined voices. Just breath and blankets and the cold metal frame of the bed beneath me. And in the morning, I woke up weightless. I no longer had a place to be. That realization didn't come with thunder or a scream. It came in the silence after sunrise, in the way the morning light slid across the floor of the shelter, catching the dust motes like small, weightless reminders of how everything floats when it isn't tethered. I sat on the edge of the cot with my hands on my knees, staring at the wall across from me. It was bare, no photos, no calendar, no memories, just chipped paint and a smudge that might have once been something, or maybe nothing. I had nowhere to go that wasn't borrowed. There was no key in my pocket, no address etched into the soft place behind my ribs. The numbers that had once belonged to me, house numbers, mailbox codes, the sound of my husband's voicemail, had faded into static. People spoke often about starting over, as if it were just a matter of picking up a new job, a new apartment, a new version of yourself at the nearest corner shop, as if identity were as interchangeable as a coat you outgrew. But no one ever told me how starting over felt like walking into the sea without knowing if there's land on the other side. And worse, not caring if there is. I walked the streets of the city like a ghost that hadn't yet learned it was dead. The sidewalks were louder than I remembered. Cars honked too fast. Neon signs blinked too harshly. Teenagers walked with cords in their ears and didn't look up when they bumped me. I passed cafes with glossy windows that reflected someone I didn't know anymore. A woman with a face softened by time, hardened by absence. Her hair pulled back too tightly, as if trying to keep something from slipping through. I didn't recognize her posture or the way she flinched when a police siren passed. I wandered aimlessly. I sat on benches without checking the time. I bought a coffee just to hold something warm, then let it go cold between my fingers. I watched people laugh and text and complain about the weather. They all had destinations. They all had someone waiting for them, or someone to avoid. I had neither. I was unclaimed. No one knew where I was, and worse, no one asked. There's a danger in drifting, not the kind that makes headlines, but the slow erosion that happens when your name isn't spoken aloud for days, when no one turns their head when you enter a room, when the space you take up is as negotiable as the air around it. I tried to find an anchor in small things. I went to the library and ran my hands along the spines of books I once taught. Steinbeck, Morrison, Plath. I didn't check any out. I just needed the reminder that once I'd belonged to a world where words mattered, where I could sit in front of a classroom and shape thoughts like clay. I visited a church I remembered from before, hoping the stained glass would offer some kind of peace. I lit a candle and sat in the back pew, but even the flickering of the flame felt too temporary, too uncertain. I left before the choir began rehearsal. I looked up my name online. There was nothing. No record of release, no articles, just a few scattered public records and a wedding announcement from 2 decades ago. A version of me in white lace, smiling at a man who no longer wore a ring. I laughed, and the sound startled even me. It was dry and brief, like a match that didn't catch. I thought about returning to the shelter, but even that place, with its thin walls and creaking pipes, felt too fixed, too full of other people's pain, So I kept walking. I ended up in a park just as the light began to change, that hour when everything softens. The trees were turning, their leaves painted in rust and fire. Children ran across the grass, their voices sharp and bright. I sat on a swing and let the chains creak beneath my weight. I didn't swing, just sat there, letting the earth tilt beneath me. A man nearby was teaching his daughter how to ride a bike. She kept falling, and he kept helping her up. I watched her face when she finally stayed upright for more than a few seconds. Her mouth opened in a wide, victorious grin. She pedaled harder, faster. Her laughter echoed down the path, and I realized I hadn't laughed in years. Not truly, not with my stomach, not the kind that makes your eyes water. I remembered suddenly how I used to dance in the kitchen on Sunday mornings. Before the arrest, before the trial, before time fractured. I used to hum while folding laundry. I used to bake too much bread and give it to neighbors. I used to hold my husband's face in my hands like he was something precious. I had once been full. Now I felt like a bottle after the ship's gone. I left the park before dusk settled. I didn't want to be the last one there, the person the groundskeeper had to ask to leave. I checked into a motel with the little cash I had left. The room smelled of cigarettes and air freshener. The bedspread was stiff and floral. I sat on the edge and stared at the wall. Again, I thought about calling someone, but I had no one to call. I thought about writing, but I had no return address, no recipient, only questions, and questions didn't fit in envelopes. That night, I left the television on just for the noise. The blue light flickered across the ceiling, casting restless shadows. I didn't watch. I just needed something that said the world was still spinning. At some point, I closed my eyes, and in the darkness behind them, I saw the face of the woman in the cafe window again, not just unanchored, but untethered, and maybe, just maybe, that meant I could float wherever I chose.